Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As the pandemic drags on, the uncertainty that comes with it weighs on us a little heavier each week. This is acutely true for tens of thousands of Minnesotans who have been laid off and are wondering how they'll keep safe, fed, and housed as winter bears down on us. Folks are watching the calendar nervously as they continue to look for work, deal with illness, and try to stay afloat. They are keenly aware that unemployment benefits are set to expire in the coming weeks, leaving with them with no income precisely when eviction, mortgage, and foreclosure moratoriums are ending. Without a new COVID relief package from Congress, this help will end over the holidays, leaving Minnesotans at the doorstep of deep poverty. You may have heard people say that poverty is easy to fall into and enormously challenging to move out of. That saying is true in better times than those we're living through. And right now, challenges are piling up faster than people can possibly respond. Even with unemployment checks arriving as they still are this week, Second Harvest Heartland food distributions have increased 30% since March. Our food shelf partners have seen a 60% increase in the number of people served in the last year, and eliminating the emergency safety net will only increase the number of people looking for food assistance, and we simply won't be able to keep up. I do want to say we absolutely welcome the state action to temporarily delay the benefits cliff. The scale of the problem requires a much larger response and resources only available to the federal government. So bottom line, if Congress doesn't act now, tens of thousands of families are just 2 weeks away from facing a Minnesota winter and a pandemic with no income. Our future without action is challenging at best. Still, our local organizations are doing everything they can to serve those on the brink of poverty, and I am so honored to be joined by three champions in this work to discuss the intersection of hunger and housing and learn what we as a community can do regardless of congressional action. I am pleased to introduce our panel this morning, beginning with the amazing Nancy Brady, the president of Neighborhood House, where families have found support for more than 120 years. Welcome, Nancy. Kathy Tenbrook is here. She's director to prevent and end homelessness at the state of Minnesota and reminds us that we know how to end homelessness. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you.
And Grant Snyder, Vice President of Operations and Outreach at Involve Minnesota, is on the call. Involve Minnesota serves homeless people because, as they say, we are a community and people matter. They do. Welcome, Grant. And let's dig in a little bit here. I'm going to start with just a general question and we'll round robin it, I think. From the perspective of your organizations, what's the connection between housing and housing insecurity? And at least one of you explain what you mean by some housing insecurity, as some folks tuning in might not be as familiar with that term. Kathy, you want to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to. Well, thank you so much, Allison, and thank you everybody for tuning into this conversation. I just want to start by thanking Nancy and Grant also that you have been tremendous partners with the state on this work since COVID hit, and of course well before then. So grateful to you. I'm also really glad that we're talking about hunger and housing insecurity together, because these issues are so interconnected and so linked to each other. And we really are not going to have such a difficult time solving one without the other. And to your question, Allison, about, what does housing insecure mean? I think, it has definitions for sure, but at its core, it really means that, while we may have 8 to 10,000 people a night who are literally without homes, being housing insecure means that you are paying more than you can afford for the housing that you have. And so we have, in addition to those who are literally homeless, we have thousands of Minnesotans all across the state, in every corner of the state, that are paying well more than they can afford for their housing. So somebody who is cost burdened is paying more than a third of their income for their housing. But we know that thousands of Minnesotans are severely cost burdened, meaning they're paying more than half of their income for their housing. And so, what I'm sure many people on this call and many out in the community have read the book Evicted by Matthew Desmond, and he very famously says, the rent eats first. So if you are not able to afford your rent and you're spending 60, 70, 80% of your income on your rent, you are going to be food insecure. You're going to have a lot of challenges to hold on to the health and well-being of your family. So I think I'll just stop there and let Nancy and Grant add.
Thanks, Kathy. Nancy?
Well, thank you, Kathy, for giving that definition, because it really is so important, and I love the comment, although I hate the reality of housing, eats first. We are a player that is a multifunctional resource for families in our community, and we try to work with multiple members of a family across programs and over time, not only to help them through crisis, but also to help build their stability and their strength and the lives they want. So we have a number of education programming areas as well. But in the food and housing, we're seeing families pre-COVID who are spending between 70 and 90% of their income on housing. And I know for some of us that might live in middle or higher income housing, it's like, oh, well, you bit off more than you can chew. For these families, most of them are inadequately housed, meaning that they're even though they're spending that much money, they are, doubling, tripling, quadrupling up in bedrooms. They've got people sleeping on floors. There's inappropriate heating systems, cooling systems. There's single pane windows. There, stoves that don't work, those kinds of things. So we have people, and it has a lot to do with the fact that they're working 2 and 3 jobs, or they're on Social Security or disability, and they simply don't have enough income to pay the high prices of housing. What happens is we try to teach people, pay your housing costs first. But really, even within housing costs, families are juggling. They may pay their rent, but then they haven't paid their water bill or their electricity bill. And when you've got families that are having to make those choices, food is one of those big choices too, right? And so that is huge. And now in COVID, we see it even more. And what we see is that families typically go to a lot of different places for their resources. And that's one of the reasons at Neighborhood House, we try to offer a wide variety. So people don't have to jump around and come to us for one and somebody else for another and somebody else for another. But it does still happen. And so it takes a lot of time and energy. And there is also a lot of struggle. Most families really want to be able to pay for their basic needs from the resources they earn through their talents and efforts. And they don't really want to have to be in this position where they need a handout, and certainly not one where they're trading off, even with our support, that they have to trade off food and housing or healthcare or transportation or childcare. These aren't luxuries people are trading off, they're necessities.
Thanks, Nancy. Grant, anything to add there?
Thank you, Allison. And Kathy and Nancy, those are just fantastic introductions to this horrible issue, this horrible reality. We in Evolve MN, our objective and our sort of niche has always been working with our unsheltered citizens. So somewhat downstream from those individuals who at one time were experiencing this this struggle with not being able to afford rent and every one of those individuals has a story that relates ultimately back to housing insecurity. So we find that hunger and all of the challenges that go along with having inadequate food or being food insecure begin with this housing insecurity issue. It produces obviously much more than just that, but hunger is one of the absolutely predictable results of not having a safe place to be, not having some place that you can afford to live, and those sorts of things. So I'm just going to leave it at that, since my other two panelist partners did such a great job.
We'll put you at the front of the line next for in a couple questions. Thanks, Grant.
Thank you.
So this one's to Nancy and Kathy. We know from our work that programs like SNAP are so vital because they can prevent people from falling into that long-term poverty by freeing up resources to cover other necessary costs. What does that look like for you all working in housing security? And, I think, why is it so important to address housing insecurity before it leads to becoming unhoused? That seems like an obvious question, but.
Well, Nancy, you go first and I'll take the second part of that.
I have two parts to my response there. One is, I think, Allison, you were the one that quoted the line about, how easy it is to get into poverty and how hard it is to work your way from there. And the same is true about housing. Once you have an eviction on your record, or even you've been filed against for eviction and maybe not evicted, as a renter, it becomes enormously difficult for a landlord to choose you as the tenant. And especially right now, where there's so few, well, right now, I don't mean right now just COVID, but like right now, this decade, there are so few affordable housing units available in our area, and the country as a whole is facing this problem, that landlords can pick a different tenant. And so it's just critical. And the other thing to remember is that so many of these families, we're talking about families with children. And when children are evicted, when children are homeless, when children are couch surfing with their families, it affects their education. It's a trauma that affects them for the rest of their lives, right? So it is something that not only affects them, but because of the impact, it affects all of us, because we are interconnected in a society. So the need to prevent eviction is absolutely essential. It creates stability, it creates opportunity. The other part, and I want to get back to the SNAP question, is about dignity. When you have trauma after trauma, and even handout after handout, right, that's needed, instead of policies that allow more people to be able to have a job that raises enough income and have housing that they can afford with that job that fits their family, there's a dignity and a human respect that comes with that. That builds people up and increases their capabilities. And the opposite is exactly the opposite. When we create unwinnable situations for people, right? That it's the catch-22. There's no good choice. There's no, it's easy to become hopeless. And it's also easy not only for our community to blame people in poverty, but for people in poverty to blame themselves. And there is no fault. It's an outcome of environment. It is not a character flaw. And it's really important that we recognize that. And that we need to create an environment where people can succeed and people can both respect themselves and be respected by others for their innate human dignity. And SNAP helps do that, right? It allows them the resource to go to the grocery store and have choice. It allows them to choose which grocery store they want to buy at. It allows them to buy foods their children will eat, that they know how to cook, that fit their cultural norms. Those are things that are really important.
Thanks, Nancy. Kathy?
Yeah, well, I would just wanted to thank Nancy also for just reminding everyone the impact on families with children. I think it's not necessarily very widely known that half of everybody in our state who's experiencing homelessness are families with children. And I think that's often a little more invisible to the general community. Well, and I was just going to say, I mean, SNAP is absolutely, I think, the backbone of our food support system. But I wanted to mention that in addition to being the backbone of the food support system, it's also a prevention tool for homelessness as well, as are so many of our, I think, our economic benefits that can weave together to support families. And to the second part of your question, Allison, preventing people from being, preventing people from falling into homelessness is one of the most critical and important things that we can do. I still find it, frankly, quite remarkable. And this speaks to the resilience and the persistence of people in our community, that not more people are experiencing homelessness in this kind of an environment when the unemployment is rising and people are in such dire circumstances. But we know that when somebody falls into homelessness, it is so difficult for them to find their way out. And it's difficult not because of, to your point, Nancy, of anything that they aren't doing, but in a housing market where we have a gap really for multiple price levels all across, but for people at the very lowest incomes, we have about 180,000 households in Minnesota that are below 30% of the area median income, so our lowest income households. And we only have 117,000 units of housing that are affordable at that level. So even just right there, you can see that there quite literally is not enough housing at the price points that people need. So if they lose the housing that they have, the chances of being able to climb out and find that next opportunity is very difficult. And it's of course, it's expensive in terms of public resources and all of that, but the real cost on children's lives, on their education and the trauma they experience goes on for decades. And so really, I'm grateful, Nancy, you said that very well, but there's almost nothing more critical right now than preventing people from falling into a homeless system that frankly is overwhelmed and overburdened as it is. And their safety net is very, very thin right now for Minnesotans.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. So when you think about right now as winter is setting in, especially on a morning like today, this morning,
Yeah.
how do your operations change during the winter months? What added challenges are there? Maybe Grant, you can kick us off on this
Sure.
one.
Yep. Well, Involve MN is dependent heavily on our outreach teams, and we've got some incredible professional outreach workers that are fully committed not only to the distribution of hot food and making sure that they're consistently getting out there to address those issues of hunger in our encampments, but also to increasing people's survivability. Minnesota, love it or hate it, it's a wonderful place to live, but it's cold here, right? And we all knew that this morning when we stepped outside. And so our mission really becomes more about survival this time of year. And we end up supporting a lot of people with a variety of things that they need out there. So, our objective at this point is to continue what we're doing around hunger. A hot meal on a cold day goes a long way for people, and it actually sparks a little bit of hope. Nancy brought up a couple of minutes ago this issue of dignity. Thanks, Nancy, for saying that, because dignity is really the cornerstone of why we believe we need to be out there, relating to people, meeting them, and providing things that on any given day are going to give them a sense of hope for getting through a cold evening or something like that.
And Grant, I understand you have a partnership with Minnesota Central Kitchen
Absolutely.
for some of those meals, which is great. Thank you so much for your partnership. What are you hearing from folks that you are encountering or giving meals to?
Yeah, in Minnesota Central Kitchen, I really have to give a shout out to the incredible partnership that they've been able to provide. I mean, for people that are used to getting frozen bologna sandwiches, for people that are used to sort of, getting what they could find, this has really changed the what it means to be resourced in an encampment environment. And, people tell us all the time how great the food is, how much they love having something hot, having something that feels like it was prepared for somebody's own family. And that really has been a cornerstone of what we've tried to do, and sort of a mantra. We won't cook for you, but we don't cook for our families. And Minnesota Central Kitchen is very much about that. And that relates back to what Nancy said about dignity.
Yeah, thank you, Grant. Nancy, how about you? How do your operations change in the winter? What challenge?
Our operations don't actually change that much in the winter. The demand shifts a little bit here and there. The rules around energy and, whether people can have their heat turned off or not. We're always working to say, don't just let it pile up, because what happens is then in the spring, people can't afford it, the piled up bill for their energy. So, we have a little bit of a different emphasis. One of the things that we end up doing is not related necessarily to housing or food, and that is that we do a lot of winter gear distribution. We just have sort of completed our initial big giant in-kind gear drive and then distribution, because people need the warm coats and what have you. And a matter of fact, one of the things, we had more adult coats donated than we could distribute to those who come to us. So some of ours were taken by our staff in a van over to a homeless encampment near us to, see whether there were adults there that wanted these warm coats. So that is part of our work. But a little bit of what you find is what foods people want. That's a little bit different. People want a little slightly, just like anybody, right? You want a little bit different food in the winter than in the summer. And right now, I would say what's different is it isn't related to the season change. It's related to the policy or availability of resource changes. We know that the state did a wonderful thing with choosing to use $100 million of their CARES Act funding to help people pay mortgages and rent and utility bills. And we at Neighborhood House have been a leading distributor of those funds for Ramsey County families, particularly around rent and utilities. We aren't doing so much on the mortgage side. But the last day for families to sign up for that money was December 7th. And we are now, rapidly, the money has to be distributed by December 30th. I am literally expecting to sign $1 million worth of checks tomorrow. That's a lot of volume of need. And families are absolutely panicked that resource is not going to be there next month.
Yeah.
And especially families that do not have an income. The other policy problem is that families have to get in arrears prior to our ability to help them, both with the CHAP program, but also with the other resources that we have available all the time to help families. And then last, the problem we have is that as the need for these housing supports has risen, and it will remain high, we will remain having access to other resources that we help families in Ramsey County to pay their rent and utility costs. What we don't have is the money for the staff to do that work. And it's really hard to secure that. And so we work super hard to earn that money and find ways through both government and individual philanthropic resources so that there are people who can support families that need those resources to pay rent and utilities.
Yeah. Thanks, Nancy. Kathy, anything to add on that?
Well, I'll just say quickly that, winter, of course, is always enormously challenging. And I think COVID has just put an extra spotlight on the challenges we face for the numbers of people sleeping outside in Minnesota. We have seen those numbers even before COVID going up every year for the last 5 or 6 years. It's just an increasing challenge because of our affordable housing crisis that we have in our state, that more and more people are ending up sleeping outside. And so in the winter, of course, that's enormously concerning. And I think what I'll add is that when COVID hit, we've had just incredible partnerships with cities and counties and nonprofits and everyone to bring as many people into safe COVID spaces as possible, including many, many people who are sleeping outside, getting into hotels, going from those hotels into housing. But we need more capacity in our shelter system. And so, by the end of this year, we will have about 300 additional spaces that are being brought online in Minneapolis to bring people inside. And I'm enormously grateful for that work together to make that happen. But it's not enough. And I think, we're not going to ever build enough shelter to end homelessness. We need to create enough housing that will really support people at all levels, regardless of their circumstances, to bring them safely home.
Very good point. I am so sorry to leave this conversation. I need to exit. My star colleague, Elizabeth, will take over the questioning. It's great to see all of you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks, Allison.
Yep, bye-bye.
Thanks, Allison.
All right, folks. So all of you have touched on this a little bit, but I want to even make a finer point on it. How can we as a community help? I'm watching the questions sort of come in, and they're all different versions of how the community can help. And I'm interested in hearing not just about time and resources, although of course I want to give you the opportunity to talk about folks bringing those, but what cultural shifts or policy changes can we make to really impact those who are highly mobile or unhoused?
Elizabeth, do you mind if I jump in? I feel very passionate about this question. So thank you for asking it. I think more important than absolutely anything, although money and time is so critical, but people using their voice to talk with their leaders at the local, the state, and the federal level about how important this work is and how unacceptable it is that anyone in our country could possibly be facing the kind of food insecurity and housing insecurity that they are. We can solve those challenges, but it's going to take both the political will and frankly the community will to demand that it changes. And special session yesterday at the state, some really important things happened, and the extension of unemployment benefits is so hugely important to support families and individuals across the state. But there were many things that didn't happen. We didn't see an increase in the resources for food. We didn't see an increases in the resources to support people experiencing homelessness who are facing evictions. And so it is going to be more important than ever that right now everybody is talking with their federal leaders and demanding that we see the kind of support that we need, because all of these families and individuals face a cliff at the end of this year that is really daunting and unacceptable. So I encourage everybody to use their voice.
Thanks, Kathy. Grant, how about you?
Yeah, Kathy, those are great comments, and thank you for that. I would add on to that, and I want to go back to something that Nancy said early in this conversation about all of us sort of being heirs to what ends when someone loses housing, when someone ends up on the street, when somebody's suffering from poverty and hunger and things like that. And so I think it's critically important, to Kathy's point, that people are invested in those discussions, and really directing that policy by making the demands of the elected officials, of the systems that are there to serve all of us, and making sure that people are aware of what our priorities as citizens are. We will never get beyond many of these challenges unless we have sort of a unified voice. To that, I would also add that what's critically important is that people sort of, everybody that I meet really wants to do something good. And that sort of energy is really inspiring. People need to check themselves too, though, and realize that there's a real tendency, especially, in homelessness in general, but really around encampments, sort of treat it like an experience. And it is an experience. It's an experience that's lived by the people that are struggling in those encampments every day. And we have to remember that encampments aren't petting zoos. And unfortunately, I have these conversations every day with people that want to go out and serve. Connect with organizations that are good at it, that know how to do it, and know how in particular to protect people's dignity, people's privacy, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, what a set of important points, Grant. Thank you. Nancy, I'd love to hear from you on that question as well.
Yeah, well, thank you both, Kathy and Grant, because those are incredibly important conversations or comments. I want to say, there's a lot of people who try to stay out of politics. They just want to help and serve. And boy, we need people helping and serving. But a couple decades ago, well, actually not a couple, but anyway, I once heard Keith Ellison say how he talks to people and they say, I'm not really into politics. And he's like, well, you better be, because it's into you. And I really believe that it is important that a lot of us who maybe don't get involved and raise our voices very often, it's really time. Because I think otherwise the politicians are hearing from the same voices. And while those same voices need to keep speaking and be loud, we need more voices saying that housing and food are foundational in our society. And that they are money spent in eviction prevention, in solving homelessness, in solving food insecurity and housing insecurity, is the return on that investment is huge in terms of how it affects us down the long term. We're not going to see it quick, right? It's an investment. Like any investment, the return on the investment comes down the road. But I want to go back to saying it's about children and it's about our future. And we need to make sure that our children in our community have what they need to grow up to be engaged, responsible, healthy adults. We've been talking about the intersection between food and housing. Food and housing are not only foundational for human dignity, they are foundational for human health. We talk all about how healthcare costs are skyrocketing and that healthcare is just a giant problem in our country. And we talk about how, there's this great debate. Should we keep with our, is the Affordable Care Act the right thing? Should we have universal healthcare? Should we go, have more private insurance? All of those things. Let's have healthier citizens. Food and housing are social determinants of health. And we need to have policies and practices that support those. And I also want to go back, you mentioned the word cultural shift. I want to go back to comments I made about poverty. And you can think of the same thing if you want to use the word homelessness. You can think of the same thing as you want to use if somebody on benefits, whether it's Social Security or disability or SNAP. Poverty is an outcome of environment. It is not a character flaw. People are not inherently lazy, incapable, bad, because they are in poverty or are homeless. They are people who have faced difficult circumstances. It's just the theme back in that old movie, Trading Places, right? There, if we traded places, we too might be in those same circumstances. So I just think the cultural shift is we need to leave judgment at the door, remember the human dignity of everyone, and we definitely need people's time and their funds without question. We also need their voices and we need their compassion.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Nancy. So we have run out of time. It has been such a wonderful conversation. I appreciate the folks who have joined in the Zoom as well as our panelists so very much. We would like to keep the conversation going. I received a couple of requests on the chat that we come back together in the new year. So I would love to make that happen. Before I let the three of you go, closing comments from any of you. Grant, anything that we haven't heard from you that you would like to leave us with this morning?
I think it's all about building hope. Let's just keep doing that. I've got some fantastic partners out there, actually three of which are on this call. And thank you so much for the leadership that my panelists friends here have continued to provide for this. You've been a model for our organization. I continue to give you all nothing but respect, and I appreciate it.
Thanks, Grant. Kathy?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add, Elizabeth, is that as our Lieutenant Governor says, when we get through this really challenging moment that we're all in as a state and as a community around COVID, we don't want to go back to normal. Normal wasn't good enough. Normal meant that thousands and thousands of people in Minnesota are not getting what they need. And those are disproportionately people from Black, Indigenous communities of color. And that's not good enough. And so I think we've learned a lot. We've seen what the community can do with the right level of resource and support. And I think that's the most important point, is that none of us want to go back to normal. We want to move forward with a new vision of what's possible.
Absolutely. Nancy?
Yeah, I want to second what Kathy said. I said it in our preparatory comments, but I love the Lieutenant Governor's line, build back better. Works well for me. I guess I would just like to maybe you guys all were very philosophical. I just want to mention that there's some really cutting edge work on eviction prevention that's being done in Ramsey County. Neighborhood House is a part of that. There are a number of other organizations, and it's being led by the county justice system itself with its own housing court. And that it is a model. We're working really hard. And at Neighborhood House, we are working in the court to try to resolve cases prior to eviction. We are working in apartment complexes to try to have tenants who are behind be able to access resources and get up to zero balance prior to the landlord filing for eviction. And we're working with the landlords to help them understand the options they have prior to filing for eviction. So, any way any of you can help us spread the word to everyone about there are ways to prevent eviction and there are resources available. It's a very, very important thing. And actually, I'll just share a YouTube website, a video access. It's called Teaming Up to Prevent Eviction in Minnesota, and it's on YouTube. And I think we can get that link in. But there are ways to prevent eviction, and we're working on them right now.
Thanks, Nancy. And now is the time. So absolutely, we're going to partner up to be sure that we share that link along with the video of today's call. So please look for it, and more to come. Thank you all so very much. Bye-bye.